my name is Elena, and I am the technical director at Modern Dream. We are a small indie studio based in Leamington Spa. If you don't know where it is, that's in England. I'm going to talk about LA Cops, which is our latest released game. And my talk is case busted wide open. So we are going to investigate some of the systems that I implemented in LA Cops. The agenda includes just a general sort of breakthrough of what LA Cops is if you are not familiar with the game. Also, how I sort of set up the level so you understand where I'm coming from when I explain about the systems. Talking about the destructible system, localization system, input system, and my favorite, scriptable objects. There's a couple of tips there at the end, and if we have time, from some Q&A. So just to give you a little bit of a background about Modern Dream, we opened at the end of 2013, and we released Typing of the Dead. It was published by Sega, and in 2014, we were very lucky to have investment for a new game, and that game was LA Cops. But before that, we used to work for a bigger studio, and we were also working on our own indie titles, including The Cat That Got the Milk and The Button Affair. There were 3 games out there, and it was really just us trying to learn Unity and develop our own games too. So for us as a team, we absolutely love art. That's one of the key things that you'll see in all of our games, is art and audio together with a nice gameplay. So LA Cops. We started development in January 2014, and for about 14 months, from absolutely beginning of the project until when it was released. And we released it for Steam, PC, and Mac, and Xbox One on March, and PlayStation 4 on April. Our team, just so you have an idea, we were 2 people when we started. So myself as the programmer and Ollie Clark as the arts. And so we both sort of did the design as well. And we had Chris Randall then doing the music side of things. And we had help from a few freelancers at different points of the project. For example, in the last 6 months, I needed another coder to help me to port the game into PlayStation and Xbox One. So I hope you can read it. What is LA Cops? It's a shooting game. It's a really fast sort of shooting experience. It's all in 3D. We have an isometric camera. You control 2 characters, so basically we set up the characters to have a lower body independent from an upper body animation system, and that combined with a 360-degree rotation camera, that was quite a complex system. I didn't want to bring my mechanism graph here because I didn't want to, everyone to run out of the room scared. It was quite a beast. So you control 2 characters. One of them is your main character, the other one is an AI, and it has a bit of a tactical sort of element into gameplay, because the AI is there to provide you another life, but also to sort of back you up. So you position the character in different places of the levels. So your aim is to go and to be a bad cop and shoot all of the enemies in the level, or you can be a good cop and you can arrest the enemies in the level and get more points. So it's up to you how you play it. The art style is really simple, really 70s sort of inspired. If you know David Hockney and The Biggest Splash, that sort of art that we inspired to. And it has a cool rock sort of audio soundtrack. We have 13 levels. Some of the levels are sort of break into parts, so you have a lot more of gameplay than just those 13 levels. And it's meant to sort of scale up in difficulties. We took this game, it was in early access on Steam, and we also took it to a few game shows. And some people, the majority of people, this is really, really hard. And then I have a few people that came to me and said, this is too easy. So it's okay. So there's 3 game modes in there as well. You have 6 cops, and you choose 2 of them. They all start with different attributes, and you can sort of level them up afterwards as you play the game. I mentioned about the tactical play, and there's also 5 weapons to choose from. You start always with a pistol. The whole scenery is, you can destroy it, and that's sort of what the first system that I'm going to talk about. And you have 9 cutscenes that sort of tell you a bit of the story about the cops. So the story is in the 70s, and we sort of touch on interesting topics that we also see in current days. So we talk about, for example, Jo Murphy. She was a female cop in the 70s. And we talk about how, in the stories, like how the other cops sort of behaved. They didn't quite feel comfortable we have a female cop there. We also talk about a bit of corruption in the game. Who knows, cops could be corrupted. So I have a small video, just so you know what the game is all about. And pay attention to the destructible scenery as well, because then it will make sense when I start talking about the system.
Ready to take a bullet for me?
Yes! You and every other dumb son of a...
Kowalski, meet your new partner, Jo Murphy.
Sir, can I...
No, Kowalski, you can't.
That was quite a slightly older video. The game is out there in, as I said, Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and on Steam. It didn't quite make it to Android, but we did have a version running on the iPhone at some point. We were very lucky to be published by Team 17 because it allowed us to then port the game into the consoles. So just a quick sort of overview how we sort of set it up. So that's one of the levels. This is one part of a full, well, one of the 4 parts of level 5 is a skyscraper level, and this is the first level that we created, is like in the whole game. And that's the one that we took to game shows, and we wanted to have like a polished sort of experience to show at very early stage to the players. As you can see, there is just a simple mesh of the level. And then we used MyLT for this, and Unity, of course. So we created the assets in MyLT, and then we bring it to Unity, and this is all the objects. So we sort of have the basic mesh, and we have the walls sort of split from the rest of the environment, just so it's quite easy to then apply box colliders in the collision for that, because that is what will then sort of determine one of our destructible sort of object types. So I used 3 different systems for the destructible scenery, and the first one we started experimenting was actually from a plugin that we bought from the asset store, and I call these fracturable objects. So as you can see just here, each object, each mesh is just broken down into loads of different parts. And just to show you, okay, this is just a level setup, so I'm not giving you the details of that system yet. So we have, if you go back, we have the mesh, we have the fractal objects, we have all the other destructible objects there. We also have the enemy spawn points, so all the enemies and all the players are spawned at runtime. And we also have level stages. And level stages is like what you have to do to sort of complete the level or to progress. So this is like an action-based system that I implemented in a game. So for example, kill all the enemies or destroy specific destructible objects that they became part of your progression. So Now, in more detail, the fractured objects from the asset store, that's the link there if you want to have a play yourself. When I first saw it, I thought, wow, this is really, really cool. There's no sort of extra art needed for that sort of system. Any mesh that you have, you sort of put into Unity, you attach one of these fractured object components to it, you sort of set how many chunks you want it to sort of slice into. You attach sort of a support plane, otherwise everything would just fall in, at runtime. You give it a material, so what is the look of it, and also effects and audio. I actually implemented my own system of audio afterwards. And then you can have a look here. This is the second system there. And I'll actually explain to you why I didn't use these fractal objects. We use it, but when we first started with our skyscraper level, it was actually 3 times bigger than what you saw there. And everything was glass. And we put these fractal objects on every single glass and everything, every wall, in the level, thinking, wow, this will be cool. It's like at runtime, you play, and every time you play the level, you have different results. When the artist gave me this level to play after implementing all the meshes, and I run it for the first time, it was like 2 to 3 frames a second. It was like, oh my God, something is happening here. And then when I went to see, it's because of this sort of object. So we, 1, reduced the size of the level, so the level became 4 parts. And 2, we made sure that the use of these fractable objects was like up to 5 in a level. With that, we had to think about, OK, so we still want a destructible scenery, so what else can we do? And this was the second system that I created, which is just mesh swaps. So this is more sort of art-consuming, because the artist will have to create different sort of meshes for a stage of destruction. So up there, you have a normal state and completely destroyed, and somewhere in between. And for this, I actually created this script. And in there, what I did is each mesh would have up to 4 destructible stages. This is just a number that I chose. And then what I'll do is that you can assign sort of which materials each stage would have. So in the case of the desk, you'd have, I don't know, metal and wood, for example. And why was this important is because then the audio system at runtime would know, oh, you shoot an object, and that is wood, so play the wood sound or the metal sound. So each of these objects had an ID, and you'd see later on with my scriptable object systems that I created, based on the ID of these destructible objects, you don't also have audio for each sort of stage of destruction. So each stage had a health, so every time you shoot it, the system would say, reduce the health, am I in which state, and it would know exactly which mesh to sort of set it visible and the other ones to turn them invisible. One of the different things here is that the players and the enemies couldn't shoot through these objects in the beginning. And players didn't really like that. So if you imagine I'm here, and if I say I have a box collider here because when I shoot is at this height, then if you can't shoot through it, it doesn't look realistic because there's nothing here visually. So we had to sort of allow the players to shoot through it, and from then it's like you sort of affect this object and you affect whatever target is in front of you. So the other system there, it was with the walls. So originally, we wanted to create the walls with fractured objects because it would be quite cool if you shoot it and you can sort of create different paths into the level. But that wasn't possible. So we created this concept of static objects. And this was something really simple. Box collider, if you shoot, if you raycast it and you shoot that wall, what it does, it creates a decal. It just spawns a decal on that. And based, if it was a glass or a concrete sort of surface, then it would spawn the right prefab on that of the decal. So quite simple. But in these walls, the enemies and the players, they couldn't shoot through it. So it just became sort of a place for you to hide or to take cover. I use this sort of similar system with the doors, but the difference between the doors and the walls is that you could actually destroy the doors. But then, so the decals here is every time that you shoot at the specific object, and also if you shoot an enemy or if you get shot as a player, you sort of spawn blood decal around at a radius on the objects that are around you. So moving on from just another system, and this is, for me, is something that I actually learned at a later stage in the second game that we were developing, which was the Button Affair. I think it's a great idea for you to always have a central script where gets all the calls of input dot get axis or get button up, down, or whatever. Because for me, one of the greatest advantages was in multi-platform development. But this started because when I was developing the Button Affair, we wanted to port the game into joystick. And we suddenly had this bug that if the player kept pressing the button all the time, it's like while the level was loading, it suddenly crashed. And I was like, wow, and I couldn't debug that. And I didn't understand why that was happening. And suddenly, because I sort of decided to have all the input system in one script, I could simply say, is the game loading? If so, disable all everything. So even if my other sort of game scripts were asking for input, it would just ignore it. And suddenly, the game didn't crash. So for me, that was a great lesson, and I apply it for every single game that I do now. But also with multi-platform. Can you imagine if your player script or if your menu system, if everything had like if-def Xbox, if-def PlayStation, you know, all with every single, and also it's like when you do the mapping for the Xbox and PlayStation controllers for PC and Mac, you know, the mapping is different sometimes for both platforms. So your code would just be completely like a mess. Whoever comes in and works with you and your team, if they had no idea what you wrote before, they'll be quite scared. So it's a huge benefit for that in that view. But also, I used it as a point of, as a messaging manager. So other objects could sort of register themselves with this input class that I created. So my input manager would have like a static list of listeners. The other class registered and unregistered on destroyed as well. Otherwise, weird things can happen if you have no objects there in those lists. Oops. So just a bit of a simple code for you to understand. We have my game input manager class. So it's just very static. And that would be, is the game paused? Yes, no. And then in there, my input class will actually have an implementation for each platform. So it instantiates based on the current platform. So that particular class there didn't really care about the implementation of it because all of that was handled there. So you can see it is quite a big function. So imagine that if you didn't have that central place, you'd have this sort of code everywhere that needs to know if the game is paused or not. And then any class would just say, hey, game input, which is my static class, is the game paused, and then do whatever you want. So it's just a much neater way of doing it. And talking about the messaging system, again, this is just a very simple script. So I have an interface with it, I input listener, and just one function. So anything that wanted to be a listener would just derive from it. Do I have it there? I can't see it. Nope. But it just used that register and unregister, and this is just how the function to just send the message when you needed one of them. So just as an example to make things a bit clearer. So I have my player, and I wanted my player to sort of receive messages. For example, when a VO object, a VO needed to be played, whether, you know, if your partner died and you wanted to say, cop down, or something more interesting than that, you'd have, you know, an action or any other game object to say game input, send message of type player VO, and then you'd have the sort of ID for that VO sort of thing if you want. So the player would then override or implement that on input event function will say, is the ID of that message something that I care about? Because if it is not the player VO, I don't care about anything else. Of course, this is a short down version of what the final script was. But just to make things a bit simpler, and then it would just call player VO and do whatever it wanted to do. And then on start, it would register itself and destroy unregistered. So pretty simple. Localization. This is one that is actually not every single person implements it in their game. And I think it's really important. And people sort of forget and leave it to sort of at the end of your game. I remember when we released The Button Affair, watching a video from a guy from Brazil. I know that because I speak Portuguese, and I could understand what he was saying in his YouTube video. And he was saying, oh, this game is quite cool, but I can't understand any of the text that the characters are saying. I was like, wow, that's a shame. He's missing out on the story. So from now on, it's like, I really wanted to just implement a localization system, and now that I created one, it's quite easy to just reuse in all the other games. And it's something that in LA Cops I implemented quite earlier on. We were using LA Cops before Unity 4.6. So every sort of UI stuff, I didn't use any other plugins. I used my own systems. So I created everything, which meant that I had to worry about what happens when you have German language, where words are quite long. When you need to wrap the text, you scale it down, and so on. So I had to implement all of that. But I'm so glad I started using Unity 5, and wow, that's like made life so much easier. So what is this localization system? Quite simple. Google Spreadsheet, available to everyone, is free. So basically, I have one column, which is the key. It's like an ID for your string. And then one column for every single sort of language. Then I sort of spent an afternoon thinking, OK, how do I sort of convert these columns into text files, for example, so the game can load? And I found Google scripting. And in about 2 hours, I managed to do this conversion. So it's out there. All the documentation is out there. So it's quite easy to do. I could even put the script up there if you wanted to. And then once we have a text file, the text files will be named after each column of the languages. So for example, in English, we would have the ID equals the actual value of the string that you want. And then I would copy all of those text files, so I'd have to download it from Google Drive, and then put it in a resources folder in my game. And then I would have a localization manager script, and that would sort of load the specific text file that you wanted for the language that you were using. So we didn't change the language dynamically, but the system is quite capable of doing that too. So for every single sort of text objects that we had, I also created a localization text object, game object, or script attached to that game object. And that script there was the bit that Unity does now, which is to handle all those text overflows issues that you have. But so, as you can see, I think it's such a simple system, but so many people sort of forget about it. And I think it's so rich, it makes your game richer and more accessible for a lot more people out there that you never thought that would be playing your game when it's out. Now, scriptable objects. This one is my personal favorite. I sort of heard about scriptable objects before developing LA Cops, but I didn't quite know exactly what they were or how to use them until I sort of hit an issue in LA Cops, which was, remember when I told you that the fractal objects didn't work? I then start using the destructible objects with the mesh swaps. And I added that to loads of instances of that in the level. And to that, I started by adding sort of loads of audio clips to each of my objects. So I had a lot of references. And in theory, Unity only sort of goes to one reference of that audio clip. But in this case, I don't know what happened, because when I started the level with all those objects, with all those audio clip references, boom, 5 frames a second. It's like, something is not right. And when I sort of started investigating how could I make it different, I found scriptable objects. So the best way to think about it is they are game objects they are objects that you don't have to, sort of scripts that you don't have to attach to a scene. In my case, I used them as assets. And they were great ways to sort of create loads of data that you could access at runtime. I think it allows sort of designers and everyone else in your team that don't necessarily code to sort of use it and add the data to it. So no scene file changes. This is great workflow. And I only had one instance of audio clips that is referenced by multiple objects at runtime, which meant frame rate was improved quite a lot. And I use this for setting up weapon data, player data, the attributes, the enemies, level data, and the scoring as well for each of the levels. So very, very easy to tweak those values and provide a very familiar interface, because what they are just normal scripts. They just derive from scriptable objects, and every single public sort of variable that you have, it will be available on the inspector, exactly like in your game objects in your scene. But this is an asset, is in your project's sort of structure, not in your scene. So how do you go on about to create scriptable objects? This here is, if you're familiar with how to change the editor, if not, this is also quite simple. So you just create a menu item, so this script has to be in the editor folder. So that is just to create, for example, an audio material container. So I did talk to you about that each of my mesh swap objects had loads of materials, and each material sort of mapped to audio clip. And this is how I did it. And here is quite simple. So you have audio material assets, and you have the scriptable object. You just instantiate that sort of script. And when you do that, you suddenly, you suddenly have your asset here in your project. So just as an example of this audio manager class or asset was simple, just a script with loads of lists. And each list represents sort of a material type of that. So if I go back here, if I click on that menu item there, if you see assets, LA Cops, audio materials container, which matches with that string over there, it will create an asset called audio materials container in an audio folder inside your resources folder. So that is the result of that. So it instantiates one of those objects there, and that is what you see. So when you click the asset here, as you can see, is a familiar inspector. So anyone that you don't have to do scripting. Once you create the system, you can give it to anyone in your team and say, hey, run with it. So I had my audio designer sort of helping me out, so I didn't have to do any of this. So if an audio didn't play, I go first to this, and if the audio was missing, hey, it's not my fault. For once, it's not the programmer's fault. So how would you then access those audio clips? I love utils classes. So for each sort of folder or type of scriptable object. So for example, I had quite a few for audio, I had quite a few for effects or for gameplay. So for each one of those sort of categories, you can call it, I would have a utils class. And that utils class will then have an instance of a static sort of object or script that would be my asset there that we created before, which is the audio material asset. So the first time that the game requires one of those audio clips, this class, the constructor would be called, which is static, so it's only called once. I would give it a path, which we created our asset in an audio folder, audio materials container, is the name of the asset. And there you go. It would just load it, and that's it. And it's there from the beginning, from the first time that you load it, and every time until you close, you exit your game. So you don't have to sort of do loads of things with memory. It's always there. It's quite easy to access. So if anything requires a specific audio clip, that is just a call. Utils audio, and then I would say, give me a random one, because if you go back, I have quite a few sort of audio clips per material. So give me a random one, and I want of type concrete, and that's it. Simple. I just love these objects. And just to give you sort of other examples of where I use them, here is like a grenade launcher, and there is just one type of sort of weapon that I have, so that was my weapon sort of asset. And again, it's just another list of different objects that is just exposed to the UI. And you have loads of attributes there. And you have the characters. For example, the characters weren't in the scene, so I needed to sort of load them up at runtime. So by having this sort of system, and yes, it was a bit hard-coded because we only have 6 characters and we wouldn't have more than that. So we had IDs, so we know exactly which prefabs of those particular characters had to be loaded. The same with the UI, because each character had its own UI prefab as well. And this is just which sort of attributes they started with. So you can see it's quite sort of easy to set up. Some people use Google Sheets to set up this sort of data. I found that it's a great alternative to use something that is already there in Unity. And also, just the final one is the game levels. Again, it's a bit hard-coded, but we knew that we wouldn't be expanding it a lot. So we have every single entry is our level. It will be saying, do you have a cutscene? Yes, no. If it's so, it knows that when you say, give me the next level, it knows to play the cutscene first. And also, it would just store all the total score in there. So I actually created this cute script that I played before building the game, which would load every single scene, so in order of that, and then grab all the doors, all the destructible mesh sort of objects that were in the scene. It would grab how many enemy spawn points I had, and it would calculate the score based on how many there are. So when you finish a level, it will compare your current score to what the ideal score would be. And everything just stored in those scriptable objects all the time there in your game. So I hope I convince you to use scriptable objects, or at least to explore them further. And finally, my tips. And these tips I decided to put in my presentation because I think that as a programmer, every time that you are doing something several times during your project, I think you should find a script or something else to do it for you. So with one button click, you do quite a few clicks that you would otherwise do. So this in particular here is just because we started with the game in early access. Fine, we only needed to build the game with those scenes. That's all we had. And then when we started adding more and more scenes, we wanted to test specific scenes. We didn't want to sort of go and tick all the scenes all the time. Sometimes we forgot to add scenes when we built the game, and it was just a mess. And when we started to have we needed the game with all the scenes to the publisher, or, oh no, but we also need to do the early access builds in the same day, or we have multi-platforms with different levels, it became a bit messy. So the trick here that you probably do this already or not, but it's just to create sort of menu system, and that one was LACOPS, just like a menu specific for the game that is just there, and this is how you create that menu. In this case, was build settings or platform specific. So if you're familiar with how Unity is set up, if you look in your sort of folder in Unity, you also have a folder called project settings. And inside there, you have input asset or project settings asset. And I decided at that point, to sort of remove all of those files from source control. So I've learned my lesson, and for my new game, I'm not putting those files in source control. What I am doing, though, is creating my own folders per platform and having my own versions of those scripts inside those folders. And with one click, those files are copied into the Unity project files, project settings folder, and I don't have to worry about it. Just a little tip, just to save some time. And this is just what this code is doing. You have the assets file path. In this particular scenario is the editor building settings assets. And you just say from path, and I want to copy to that, and you just copy the file. Easy. My second tip, and this one might be a bit harder to visualize, but it's just what I call a UI shortcut. So I was finishing the game on standalone versions, and suddenly we started creating the PlayStation and Xbox versions of the game. And if you have developed for those consoles, you have certain TRCs and TCRs to comply. Otherwise, Microsoft or Sony, they don't allow you to release the game. So it's quite time-consuming, and sometimes what it makes console development quite difficult. And as you can see, just in the bottom of that image, you have those select help options. And my name there, which is just a user picker sort of button that you are required to have in your main menu. And as you imagine, I don't need those buttons for PC or Mac, and I need different sort of buttons for PlayStation. They might be similar, I just need them with a different image. And again, this is where my scriptable objects are great, because I can just create a scriptable object to store, to map each button with sort of A is this image or this material, B, and so on. And here is the complicated part, and I'm going to try to explain it. So basically, I had one prefab, and I started with an Xbox One buttons manager, so I would have another one for PlayStation. And in that, there will be a script called platform specific. And I'll tick the box if I wanted that to only be available for that particular platform. So if I was running buttons manager's the platform-specific script on standalone, and because it's only ticked for Xbox, it would completely disable everything. And all of those buttons there that you see, Xbox spawn A and back and help, none of those will be spawned and runtime at all. But if it is Xbox, it will then spawn those buttons. So it will know, based on the current platform, which sort of images to put in there. And then my menu system or my scene system sort of script would then look for one of those. And if there are one of them in there, it's like one of the buttons manager, it will say, hey, I'm an Xbox. So I actually know that this particular menu requires a select and also requires a back. So a back button, that is. So what it will do is like, OK, I have those buttons in the scene. So when those buttons are pressed, I'll determine what happens. And it was quite easy. I don't know if it makes sense or not, but as a prefab like this, it was so easy to then just put these prefab into, say, the pause menu, because it was all handled there. The only thing I needed to do was for my pause menu to go, hey, do you have the buttons manager there? Yes, OK, so when the B is pressed, do this. So again, this is part of my tip to just saying, if you think that you're repeating what you're doing, whether it is in the editor or whether that is in scripting, always try to find a common path there to sort of reduce the time that you're doing it. So really, just as a summary now, keep your scene tidy. It's like how many times you go and open a scene and suddenly you have game object 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1,000. What do they mean? No idea. So be wary, because when you start a project, you never know if you have other teammates. So think ahead and have the scene tidy, rename things properly, keep your code tidy. Again, it's like when I started, it was just me as the programmer, but I had other freelancers to help me out at the end of the project, especially when things get really heated up and all the hacks start happening in the code. So keeping your code tidy from an early stage, sort of give yourself, OK, I have to comment this code just in case some other people will have to use it. It's just best working practices, really. When you develop a game, make sure that you're working with people that really care about the game and about what you're doing. as an indie developer, I can tell you that last year was hectic, was crazy, but I absolutely loved it. And LA Cops was the fruit of that. And so we put so many hours and much passion into a game. And if you have teammates that are just there and say, yeah, I did that, yeah. It's like you don't have a motivation in your team. You need a great dynamic. So make sure that you're working with people that care. Be flexible. A system that you spend a week or 2 weeks creating, or even a month, may not be the system that you have at the end. Be flexible about that. Don't be so precious about it. Iteration is the key when you're developing games. Build a community around your game. I think we tried to do that with LA Cops by putting the game on early access on Steam, and we were doing quite well in the beginning. And personally, I think we failed a bit. We were listening to our community. We were doing as much as we could to implement the feedback that our community was giving to us. However, we got a new publisher, and we wanted to port the games to consoles, and suddenly, with a small team, we didn't have the resources that we needed to sort of keep that momentum going with our community. So I would definitely say early access is great, but make sure you do have those resources and you put in the time in your project to sort of be there and implement those features. And be clever on how you develop your game. Always find those scripts if you're a programmer, or pester your programmer to do it, or go online. There's always great tips there on how you can save time. And ultimately, have fun. We are game developers. We are creating fun experiences, hopefully, for people to enjoy. So that's it. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? I guess we still have time. 15 minutes, I did well. No?
Yeah, I had a question about the art style. And kind of how did you find it? How did you get there? Can you talk about that?
The art style.
Yeah.
How we decided to go with that sort of style.
Yeah.
I'm not the artist, but I'll try to put my artist hat. So Ollie created this sort of look in the Button Affair game that we made, and we wanted to sort of bring it back. So it's really inspired on the 70s, and it's like posters, from the Monaco times, or even the biggest splash. If you see it, is quite sort of simple shaded, like flat shaded, like you saw in the game. So anything in particular that you wanted to know? It's like, the idea is, I know that Ollie just keeps looking at things and we go a lot to to art galleries. I wish they would have game galleries, but to art galleries and get inspiration from those painters. If you go back and have a look at the Category Milk, for example, you see that there's a lot of influence from Kandinsky in there. There's a crazy level at the end. So we are just trying to bring what those masters created and put into the game. Really.
Yeah. So how long did you take it to find the style? Was that a pretty?
Sorry?
How long did it take to find the style? Was that a pretty long?
To find a style?
Yeah.
So with the Button Affair, we were developing for a year that game, but Ollie did a few months. So it's really just everything that keeps going in your head. Just grab as much as inspiration as you can from everywhere that you go, and suddenly you decide, hey, it should be quite fun to do this. So I think he would probably be the best person to answer that one. Okay. Any more questions? Or we all want drinks right now, right? All right. Thank you very much for listening.